Okay, now you see it, and it's moved.
It's the reasons for terminating pregnancy.
And now?
Yeah, methods of terminating. Yes.
Wonderful. Okay, good. So we're talking about terminated pregnancy. Obviously, it's a big subject for us and for our balabatim, and there's a lot to speak about. We're going to do it run through it, and I'm sure a lot of the people know. I want to speak about see a little bit of the nuance. And I think I was recently in New York, and around the whole question of scrapping Roe versus Wade. And I think that what was very obvious was that it's a very black and white issue. It's either you're for abortion or against abortion. I think that what we from Newton can show is that there is a nuance here. There are cases which are more complex. So what are the reasons for anyone to terminate pregnancy? So everybody thinks it's only unwanted pregnancy. It could be lots of other reasons. It could be a failed contraception, of course, cases that are usher, rape, incest, illicit sexual contact, danger to the mother, which is also an issue that is very important. We're going to speak about obviously in a moment. Multifetal pregnancy. We spoke already about about multifetal pregnancies, about their danger. It could also, of course, what's the most common on the dion and the poskim is the congenital abnormalities, and of course also exposure to teratologic agent to exposure to things during pregnancy which are potentially harmful. What are the methods that we have at terminating pregnancy? So first thing we have morning after pill. It's the most simple thing. So we have the plan B, one step after which basically stops ovulation, and therefore must be taken within 3 days after intercourse. So if some woman knows she forgot to take a contraception, or they're going through PGD, then they need to have contraception. They forgot to take it, and they had intercourse, like a couple that I spoke to yesterday. So this is something that can be taken next day. We often think that this would be a good answer for rape or for incest. The problem with those cases is that mostly that the people don't come forward with that information until well after the first 3 days, and so people don't say they were raped, or they were even Hadish doesn't say they were raped. Remember that most rape takes place within the family, so it could be it's a family member, it's a father, it's a sibling, an uncle, a grandfather that's the rape. They don't want to come forward, so it's very important to remember that. There's another Ella, which is a slightly different method, is it blocks progesterone. So basically it stops the implantation. The stopping ovulation stops the fertilization, and the blocking of progesterone stops implantation. And that can be taken even later, because even we know in the first 3 days we have fertilization, but the actual implantation takes place later. So that can be taken after 5 days. And the other thing we can do emergency is do an emergency IUD insertion, which will cause miscarriage in almost all cases, not all of them. So all those are very, very early stage. Later on, we get into progesterone, which is a mephigen or cytotec, which can be taken after 60 days of amenorrhea, which basically causes a miscarriage. Metroxact, which would give to, in the case of an ectopic pregnancy outside of the uterus. We can do surgery, so we can do a DNC, and that can be done up to 14 weeks usually, but can be theoretically done until 21 weeks, and we can that's not inducing birth, and we can of course induce birth. So all of those can be done, and all those are methods of terminating pregnancy. So let's look at the halacha. I'm sure many of you know a lot of these makorot and these things that have been widely written about and discussed. But b'chol ofen, the Mishnah says, "Apel yom arba'im ein chashish levad, yom arba'im ve'echad teshev lezachar nekeva l'nida." And Rabbi Shmuel says, "Yom arba'im ve'echad teshev lezachar nekeva, yom shmoni ve'echad teshev lezachar nekeva l'nida." Why? Because Rabbi Eliezer says there's a harnig malal being vechad, but nekeva l'shmoni vechad. Nachamim said no, it doesn't matter, they're the same. So this seems to be a makor that most people bring in, that Yom Arba'im vechad, or Yom Arba'im is when life begins. And when does life begin? And Yom Arba'im, that seems to be the conclusion of the Mishnah. And that's what the Rambam says in his Sur Beya. Pelet b'toch Arba'im einam tmei leida, afilu b'Yom Arba'im, ipila b'Yom Arba'im vechad me'achar tashmish harei ze safek yoledet. This is lechal nekeda ulenida, naita tzorat adam. So the Rambam says is that there are stages of embryonic development, and the beginning is up to 40 days. Is nothing. It's maya ba'alman shubdavar, and that's if he miscarries, nothing. But after that, it already becomes shafim merukam. That's really when life begins. So he says, what is shafim merukam? Tchilat biato shel adam gufo kadasha is like a lentil. Shtein up dipot zvuv muchokoba, like the eyes on the side of the head. Chotmav kishteti pei zvuv mekuavot zelazeh. Face, the nose is all shkvetzt up. Piv patur kechut asara, slightly open. V'chituch v'yadayim ra'yim elo. He doesn't have arms and legs. So we mentioned this when we spoke about doing a pidyon ben after a miscarriage. We mentioned this Rambam because this is a very important source that seems to suggest the Rambam says that when does life become obvious, or when does it become that we had a hapala, is when we see arms and legs. And so when we mention it, if a woman would come and say, I had a miscarriage, do I do pidyon ben for the next child? The question we say, let's see the report, let's see the ultrasound report. If we have arms and legs, then clearly that was alive. And if it was less than arms and legs, then we don't think it's alive. So that seems to be pretty intuitive. That's when life begins. It's 40 days, and the verm you're doing. If you look at the stages of embryonic development, that's pretty exact. Because if we look at somewhere between fetus on 4 weeks and fetus on 10 weeks, fetus on 4 weeks is not a human form at all. And fetus on 10 weeks is a human form. And somewhere between those two is we have Yadayim V'Reglaim. And if you go back to the presentation that we had on miscarriage, you'll see actual exact pictures of day 40 and day 41, etc. We see exactly what the Rambam says. So, but the Gemara in Masech Nida says that Kama Ukar Ubara. We have another concept of Ukar Ubara. So was Rabbi Shimon Rabbi Meir Shlosha Chodashim. Rabbi Shein Ra'el Devar Zechel Devar Shneimar Vayikim Shlosh Chodashim. V'Gomer Zechel Devar. Says Gemara, what do you mean Zechel Devar? Krankutiv V'Rai Gedola. It's clearly a pasuk that says Shlosha Chodashim. Answers the Gemara, Mishum the Ikeh the Alda Litet Veikeh Alda Shivat. Some women give birth after 9, and some give after 7. Says Rashi Shema Nikaru Ubara L'Shlish Yemeh. I says Rashi, what happens is the first third, or what we call the first trimester, is when we say that wasn't yet life, or wasn't Hukaru Bara. And even though Hukaru Bara is obviously speaking about, as we know, about Mesuleket Damim, that's clearly a milestone on pregnancy, on the continuing of pregnancy, and it becomes very important. So maybe that's also a plane where life begins. It's discussed in the poskim. This is very interesting. Aruch HaShalom, we mentioned this before. So the Aruch HaShalom suggests that in fact life begins well before that. It begins already in the sperm cells. Like Heitzgauer has the picture in 1694 of the little sperm cell with a little human being inside. We know that's not true. So we know that isn't what sperm looks like. But that's just a very interesting idea that maybe life begins before, but that's not used. However, the discussion of the Gemara is really not around 40 days. The discussion of the Gemara is around somewhat much later. Shafech dam adam ba'adam damo yishafech. Kibesele monhim asad adam, says the pasuk about by Bnei Noach. And the Gemara Masechet Sanhedrin, very famous Gemara Daf Nun Zayin Amud Bet, says that a goy is aser to kill ubarim. My time at Rabbi Ishmael. Dichtiv shofech dam ha'adam ba'adam damoy shafech. Ezu dam shehu ba'adam haveom ezu ba'adam. So really, when it would the fact that the pasuk seems to add a superfluous word, ha'adam ba'adam, it could have said shafech dam adam damoy shafech. We learned that if you kill someone, you're put to death. And the addition of that word ba'adam seems, as Rabbi Shmuel explained, that there's some other concept. There's adam ba'adam, and therefore that's the prohibition to terminate pregnancy. According to that, is so the right, and it's so the right to goyim. And the Tosfot says that that's the ubar for the goy is aser. In fact, even maybe from the beginning of life, even from conception plus. Says the Tosfot, it can't be for a deer, therefore yid is patur. It's still a sore. We're going to see in a moment. That's the sugya that the Gemara speaks about. There's a machloket between the makorot. Says the Tosfot, what's the answer? Yes, Nami B'Yisrael mitzvah kedei latzil. Says the Tosfot, that's not talking about when does life begin. It's a sword to terminate a pregnancy. So we can tell me in a moment we're going to see the makor, the Yetzarosh go eno gimbo, and before that we kill the baby to save the mother. Says the Tosfot, nachot. We have a different mitzvah. The mitzvah is latzil nefesh of the mother. Therefore, there's a mitzvah. But bifnei atzmo, it's a sword to darog ubar. Apparently, at any stage, it doesn't have a distinction between 40 days. And the Rambam Chot Melachim says, "Beno sharag nefesh afilu uba b'me'imo nerag alav. V'chen imarag terichva o shekafto eno lifnei ari o shenicho bera'av o shemet ho'il ve'imit bekol makom nerag." Is a so for any type of killing, including uba b'me'imo, which is no limitations of when does that mean. So it could be from the beginning, from conception plus, like the Catholics think. The Catholics think that that's when life begins, right after conception. Masha ein kain b'Yisrael, and the Jew is not nerag alav. However, we saw in Tosfot it's still patur aval asur. So that seems to be the beginning. And the Tosfot says ben yom echad haorgo chayav. The Tosfot says mefurash yom echad. The Ketani aval ubar lo. However, ubar he's not chayav. The for yid for goy lechora even then. The lehainu afilu neherga or yavsha or yashva la mashber ad sheyatza rosho. So that's what, but that's only when the baby is born is the beginning of life. So the Tosaf Mefurash says that even though before we said there's a soul for a yid, here it says the chor is not muchayav in a chiyuv until the child is born. The Chavod Yair, the Yair Bachar says according to that. And he read the Yesh kan shalosh chilukei dinim beubar. K'shemeta imo chayav ogo leubar k'da'akar. B'da'akar. If the mother dies and the child starts being born, then it's asur. Uba'adayin chayav, she's still alive, I'll go patur. Then it's patur v'lasur I'll go. Amida'akar, mashakatal k'da'akati lo akar, mashma demutar. But before he starts being born, then l'chora there's no isur. L'chora says the Chavot Yair, it's mutar. Niachiyazah says v'yesh lomar. The Tanakama sham paliga lididei. If shal de bemet ein isur Torah. Maybe there's no isur Torah to kill an ubar. Maybe it's isur Rabbanan. Maybe there's no isur Torah. Not that we're not mechayav, but maybe there's no isur Torah bichlal. That's what the chor, the chiluk of the Chavot Yair. But Moshe, very famous Tshuva, says ta'ud sofer anikar. Lo yachol liot. It's ta'ud sofer. Rav Moshe's Tshuva appears in Choshen Mishpat, but in fact it's actually a tek. There's a Sefer Zikron of Rav Abramsky, Zatzal, and there Rav Moshe has a long article in the Sefer Zikron that's really the basis of the shorter Tshuva that he gives in Choshen Mishpat, the very famous Tshuva in Choshen Mishpat, Chelek Bet Siman Samachtet. But there he says ta'ud sofer. It's close. Pashut lo yachol liot that the Tosfot would say such a crazy thing that there's no isur, but there's isur. The Maharit, famous Maharit, says in Sadi Zayin, in Sadi Tet, he says, "Ibud nefashot ein kan, afilu b'Yisrael nefalim lav nefesh, u'mamon hu dechayav v'rachmana dami v'ladot lebal." So really, says the Maharit, there's no isur, but it's a question of mamonos. It's the rechush of the bal, and you're killing it. However, in Sadi Zayin, he says, "Yotzeh lehareg shani hoil v'sofo lereg imimo ubar yerech imo." He says that it's yerech imo. There's no problem with killing it. However, once it already comes out, then it's already a problem. And so there seems to be a stira between the two tshuvot. There also Rav Moshe is a ta'ud sofer. Rav Moshe seems to use ta'ud sofer lot in the sugya, but it's a question about exactly how do we see this. One tshuva that they discuss. That's been discussed again in many places. So if we look at a continuum of birth, we had one makor that says 40 days. Maybe the Tosfot and the Gemara in Sanhedrin seems to say conception. We saw also the first trimester and we saw of course birth. And if we look at that trimester, really the discussion is in that circle, is in that somewhere around here. However, if you actually look at the makor that we're going to see in a moment, that's not really the discussion. So who the Osrim who says it's all Torah? So there's a long list that says it's all Torah. The Maran Shig also says it's Ritzicha. The Maritz of the Pes says Chabala. There's a question of Mamonos that we just saw. Rosh Shlomo Zalman says it's Gezel. The Rav Uziel says it's stop moneh chaim, stops life being born. The Zohar says it breaks down the binyanon shel olam shel HaKadosh Baruch Hu. The Yavet says it's isur ashchatat zera. It's not alive, but it's isur ashchatat zera. It's still zera. The Rav Shlomo Dreamer says it's sakanat ha'em. You're endangering the mother anytime you do a termination. Rav Vosner says if we mechalel Shabbat to save a child, so kavachomer we soul rogato. It can't be that we mechalel Shabbat we're allowed to kill him. I gave Rav Weiss in a shir recently said exactly the same svara. I said that means only svara makes sense. And the Oil Moshe, Moshe Horowitz says it's a chilul Hashem. There's no real isur, but it's a chilul Hashem to do such a. That's the isur d'oraita. Some says it's isur d'rabbanan. We saw Achiezer says like that. Eliezer maybe says like that, and the Beit Yehuda says also like that. That it's isur d'rabbanan. Well, how can you get this Yisur D'Rabbanan? Where does it come from? So the real makor we know is a Mishnah in Masechet Ohalot. The Mishnah in Masechet Ohalot says the following: Aisha she maksha leled, woman who's in danger during childbirth, and this is what we just saw already, quoted strongly in the Tosfot before, and quoted already. We saw in the Chavos Yair. Isha she maksha leled. The woman's in danger of birth, in childbirth. We save her life, and that's what the Tosfot said. That's a chovah latzil. That maybe it's a chovah for a goy as well. We save her life because her life comes first. Yatzar rubo, once his most comes out, we'll see in a moment the Rambam says head, but the Mishnah says most. Ain't no gimbo. Once the majority comes out, we don't touch it. Because we don't push off a nefesh from a nefesh. The pshat of the Mishnah is that the nefesh only comes into the body when the head comes out, or when the majority of the body is expelled from the uterus. Only then can we consider it to be alive. It's only then it's got a nefesh. Before that's not nefesh. That's her life is comes first because it doesn't have a nefesh. Once it comes out, she's got nefesh and he's got nefesh. Mashma that nefesh comes into the child at birth. So when does life begin? Not in the where we just said before, in conception trimester low. Life begins at birth, or birth minus, just before birth actually occurs when the child is fully expelled. That's really the discussion. And if we would break it down, and I've done this for irreligious audiences and for medical students, it's actually, I think, a good way of presenting it. And I'll send you, of course, the slides. And if we think of the two cases, we have before the majority of the body is out and after the majority of the body is out. Those are the two cases. And what's the decision? In the case one, pregnancy is terminated. And in case two, we do not interfere. And what's the reason? The reason seems to be very clear. In the second case, the Mishnah tells us, because the baby has a soul. And therefore, we can deduce that in the first case, the reason is because the baby does not have a soul. That seems to be the deduction. In which case, a kol pashut. So when does life begin? Life begins when the baby's head comes out. If that's the case, before the baby is born, there's no isur. That's what the Sicilians is going to tell us. There's no isur because it's not considered to be alive. That's the pshat of the Mishnah. And then we go back to what we said. That's what we see in Tosfot, does in the Chavatir and others. We saw that in the Chora. There's no isur until the baby's out. Once the baby comes out, then it's a different thing. Mida akar. However, the Rambam, in presenting this Gemara and this Mishnah, says it somewhat differently, based a little bit on the, as we saw already in the Sanhedrin. It says the following: in the Hilchot Rotzech Halacha, Perik Aleph Halacha. Avzo mitzvah lo taseh shelo lachus ad nefesh avotef. There's an isur. There's a prohibition. There's a lo taseh, not to be merciful on the roidif. Leficha hu hachamim shehu bara shehu makshel aled, and therefore say the hachamim. Wait a second. Before we get into that, the Rambam is talking about the din rodef. He came here to tell us there's din rodef. It's perik ilchot rotzich. It's perik aleph. He discusses this concept of rodef, and he says we have a prohibition. We have a lo taseh not to be lenient on the rodef, and because we have that prohibition, therefore, says the Rambam, and that's the reason why we're allowed to kill the baby before, because the baby is endangering the mother's life. He's horegota. He's rodefota. He's a rodefota. That's it. Okay, and the Rambam at that point should have stopped, because the halakha would have made a lot more sense than it actually does. Because the Rambam then continues, because the Rambam is the Rambam, so he's the most honest and powerful intellectual that Am Yisrael maybe produced ever. So he says, okay, but that's the end of the mission. That's case A. What about case B? Says the Rambam, once he put his head out, we said not Rov, but Rosh, that seemed to be the same thing, on a regular birth, not on a breech, but delivery. The head comes first, and therefore the head is roif. When his head comes out, eno gimel. Why? Because he's not a rodef? No, because endochim nefesh v'nei nefesh. V'zeo tivo shalom. That's the nature of the world. So the Rambam here is an internal stira, because the Rambam said in case A, the reason was he's rodef and not rodef. In case B, the reason that rodef suddenly disappeared, and what is instead nefesh, not nefesh. So that's the chora stira neobei. So if we look at the Rambam, right, if the Rambam in the exactly the same presentation we says same halacha, but the reason is completely different. Reason 2 was the baby has a soul. Reason 3 is a pursuer. Those two things don't fit in together. There's stira. It's not only that as a stira, because the baby continues to be a rodef. If the baby is endangering the mother's life, in case A, he's endangering the mother's life. In case 1, his case 2 exactly the same. Why? Because the mother's got as much chance of dying after the baby's out as before the baby's out. And therefore, to say he's not a rodef, he stopped being a rodef is crazy. It doesn't make it's illogical. And therefore, the Rambam, the Chora, shoots himself in the foot. Because he says, on the one hand, it's rodef, and then he could have stopped there, and we would know better. But the Rambam, no. And then so the second case is another case, and there it's because he has a soul. So he didn't have a soul before. So if he didn't have a soul, why is he rodef? So those are the two shilas on the Rambam. The Rambam here is looking very pensive in the statue in Cordova. Why is he a rodef? Why does the Ram have to say that? The Ram could have said nefesh, not nefesh, and the Ram wouldn't have put it here. And then the thing goes, why did he stop being a rodef? Why does he stop being a rodef? Because he put his head out. That's really the shayla. So the Sitz Eliezer,
maybe the mother's a rodef to the baby.
Oh, so nifla. That's Rav Moshe's answer. So the bucket is very smart, and either he knew Rav Moshe Balpeh, or he's even smarter than that, and he guessed Rav Moshe, which is really good. But that's Rav Moshe's answer. So we'll get to Rav Moshe in a moment. So we don't have time to read the whole Sitz Eliezer inside. I'll send it to you, and it's a tshuva, very very famous tshuva. The Sitz Eliezer Chelek Tet Siman Nun Aleph is probably the first comprehensive discussion that the Sitz Eliezer has of medical halacha. There's a medical halacha throughout Sitz Eliezer, but where it really starts being an issue is in Chelek Tet in Siman Nun Aleph. Every person in medical halacha should know the Sitz Eliezer Siman Nun Aleph and Chelek Tet Balpeh. That's something you should have bekis. So there he says only kar nefesh. There's only kar nefesh. Why? There are a lot. We'll just look at the second paragraph here. We just said. כיוון שההתר לא גול לפני כן הוא מפני שלא נקרא נפש, בין שם רוצח ומיתה עליו, אם כן, מדוע צורך לנמק הרמב"ם עוד זאת שהתר לא גול מפני שהוא כרודף, טיפוקלי שאפילו אינו רודף. חייבים לגר אותה, להציל את אימו, שחייבים לגר אותה. And the second thing we said, what is stopping רודף? answer the Sitz Eliezer. את שתי הקושיות האלה, שאל גם כן הגאון מרשע ופיק, לנודע ביהודה, בתשובתו שם. ועל הקושייה הראשונה השיב לו נודע ביהודה שתמל תמיהתו. What's your question? Why does he need rodef? Of course he needs rodef. The atami uta laharog et atreife latzil et hashalem. Ze lo shamanu meolam. The Nodab Yehuda has a brilliant explanation here, which is a chidush atzum that doesn't appear anywhere in the Gemara before, any of the Rishonim before. That he says the following: when we said when does life begin, we have an assumption. There is a logical assumption that the life and death are an on-off issue. Either you're alive or you're not alive. Either you're dead or you're not dead. But the halacha, which is where, again, we get into those nuances, right, of pro-life and pro-choice, is to understand that life is more complex than that. There are in-between, and then there are halachic categories which are in between life and death. There's goses, and it can't be goses, because goses is the end of life. But there's another category, which is treifa. And a treifa, if you would take a chicken and you smash it on the head, and it lives for 12 months, or for 11 and a half months, it's a treifa. It dies on 11 and a half months, it's a treifa, right? Why? It's still alive, but it's not fully alive. So there's an in-between category in halacha, which we don't have in American law. I don't think that the High Court, that the Supreme Court, have that nuance to understand. There's an in-between category, and that's called treifa. So the B'nai says you can't say nachon that the unborn child is alive, but he's not alive. Is lo yoresh, and he's lo chel b'truma, but lo machil b'truma, as the Mishnah and the Braita says throughout the Shas. However, you can't say he's dead. He's not an inanimate object. Therefore, there's some in-between category. We'll call it treifa. And the treifa, you're not allowed to kill. So like la roga the treifa. Not only that, when mechalel Shabbat for the treifa. ומה בקשר תריפה אינו חייב מכל מקום איסור בידיים עושה להרוג את תריפה אפילו שבת החמורה מחלים על חיי אישה ולהציל את השלם אם אינו מציל הרי הוא שב אל תעשה ולעניין עוברים, if we go back to the ubar, if we consider it as a treifa אף שאין מחלים שבת בשביל העובר אם אין סכנה לימו מכל מקום כיוון שכל פנים אסור להרגו אם כן אליו דמחשב קצת רודף יותר עדיף להיות בשב אל תעשה. Says in Nodab Yehuda, we don't kill a treifa. We don't kill a treifa b'yadayim. Shev al taseh. What's shev al taseh? Sit back and don't interfere. But that's only in the case in which it's purely only treifa. But if I can add, it's somewhat analogous to a rodev. It's kerodef. It's a little bit analogous. It's similar to a rodev. It's somewhat endangering in some level the mother's life. Then it's not a treifa anymore. It's not a regular treifa case. It's a treifa plus something, and the treifa plus something is enough of an issue in order to be able to terminate the life and to choose it. The mother will become first, will take precedence over the baby. ועל כל פנים לא היה מותר להרגו בשביל הצלת אמו אם לא נחשב קצת כרודף. על קושיה שנייה כמעט והסתג בנודמה והשיב לו בלשון הכתי לא בדבר לי דבר ברור זה. But it makes a lot of sense. Why? What it does mean? The answer to your first question answers the second question. It's kerodef, it's somewhat analogous to a rodef. After he's born, he's not a treifa plus something. He's a human being plus something. Human being plus a little bit analogous to rodef. That's not a death sentence. Lo mahani tu mashu grak mixad gorodef. Yetiru ali dekein damola hago mishum kach. Ela mebitim azal agorem ekari shelo hu ela mishmaya hu karat fela. But tivo shulam muzeh. That's exactly what the Rambam says. Beautiful explanation of the Sitzalias. Nesakem. The Nodav Yudah says that you're correct. The unborn fetus is not considered alive. It's a treifa. And therefore, treifa by itself, we don't kill. But treifa plus something, a little bit endangering the mother's life, would be enough, sufficient grounds to give it a death sentence. However, once it's born, it's a human being. Human being plus almost like Rodef isn't enough in order to determine that that is a death sentence to that being, to that born one. And that's what he says. So that's the sikkum of the Sitzalias. He's a treifa, but he's like a Rodef. He's not a real Rodef. No. The problem with the Sitzalias is that kerodef doesn't necessarily mean what he says it means. Because ke, the prefix kaf in Hebrew can be kamo, so he's like a noun, the rodef. But if the word rodef is a verb, kerodef is a present progressive verb, meaning that he's in the process of doing that action. So if the rodef is a verb, therefore he's in the process of attacking her. It's not like a rodef. And then if you look at the Rambam, look at the original in the Arabic, there seems to be more that it's a verb than it is a noun. The other thing is that if it's a little bit similar, analogous somewhat to the rodef, I don't think the Rambam will put it in Perek Aleph. He put it in the end. Why do you put it in Perek Aleph? That's Sheila. Now Moshe Yedua completely disagrees with the Sitzalias. And he says, Lo yachol liyot, and you see beforish that the Tosfot and the Rambam, everybody says that it's a rodef. And everybody says it's asur. And the Rambam says, he says even more, it's mefurash in the Rambam. Because why does the Rambam say rodef? Because without rodef, but it would be asur larogoto. Because he's a human being. It's asur larogu barim. So what does the Rambam have to say rodef? We said, one of the questions, why does the Rambam have to say rodef? It doesn't appear in the Mishnah. Answer was because without the rodef, but maybe asur. And therefore it has to say rodef. That's Moshe's answer. However, how do you do the steering afterwards? It seems to be that he stops being a rodef. So Rav Moshe says, first of all, Masha, your question on the Rambam. So you have a kush on the Rambam. All right, no, very nice. Nobody died from a kush on the Rambam. And you see that none of the Rishonim asked that question until the Nodav Yudah. And so it's so obviously the Raiva didn't think it was a problem. So the Rav Moshe has a beautiful answer, which is a beautiful shir agav for Balabatim. This is a great. This sugya is a wonderful shir for Balabatim because you have looking at the same sugya that they seem to say the exact opposite, which is a beautiful understanding of halacha, and the Rav Moshe's understanding that how he understands kushot on the Rambam is beautiful. It's much nifla. And he says, when does the Raiva ask the question of the Rambam? Everyone knew the Rambam was right. But and every question that the Raiva asked, the Rambam had an answer. But the Raiva didn't like the answer. So that's when the Raiva asked. If the Raiva doesn't say anything, doesn't mean he didn't have a question. It means the Rambam had an answer, which I like the answer. So you don't think that the Rambam didn't have an answer to this halacha. Gideon Weissman can think this is problematic. And the Rambam, who's light years greater intellect than any person ever met. So the Rambam didn't think that it was a stira. Lo yachol liyot. The Rambam knew the answer. So Moshe says, when I was in Ljubljana, I came with a teretz. You know that we know that a lot of the ktavim that Rav Moshe had in Ljubljana were lost, and Moshe either found some of them or he reminded them from himself. He says, what's the answer? Mishmai keratfe. What does it mean kishmai keratfe? Which is the lashon hagema. Eino tam lo mash eino rodef ela de bishvil ze havu shneim rodef. Exactly what Rav Vakita said. They're both rodfim. The mother and the baby are both rodfim. ופרושו, אם אין אתה יודע אם הקטן רודף את האישה, או אישה רודף את הקטן, they both, don't you, they can't both live. האם יש נעשה שאי אפשר שיהיו שניהם? כשיוולד עוולה תמות האישה, כשיוולד עוולה יולד חי שיצא איברים איברים, תחיה האישה. So either the mother's gonna live or the baby's gonna live. They can't both live. That's Mishmai Kerat Fela. We don't know. The Kadosh Baruch created a situation they can't both live. That's Rodef. But once he put his head out, the mother and the baby on the same halachic level. Before he put his head out, they're both Rodfim. But I can make a decision who I save. The mother, her life takes precedence. Why? Shuhauba eno adain nefesh gamur. He's a nefesh, he's alive when I look at him himself. If I say, can I terminate pregnancy? The answer is no. But if I have to save either mother or baby, then the decision is very easy. I save the mother. Once the baby's head comes out, then it's an impossible decision again because they're exactly on the same halachic level. Doesn't matter if you're 2 minutes old or if you're 60 years old. You're still on the same halachic level. It's still the same chovot. And therefore, as the Mishnah said, we just said before, it's machil b'truma v'yoresh u'marish u'machil b'truma v'ochel b'truma v'chule v'chule. So on that level, then I can't change. Shenimsar she'ali yitaron she'ika lehem u'ba shu nefesh gamur v'yein nefesh gamur. Then the uba is a rodef. Then we say, who's the rodef here? Ubar. Once they came out, he's a rodef, she's a rodef. Who's the rodef? We don't know. But before he came out, that's what the Rambam says. He's a rodef. Afterwards, once he's a nefesh, then they're both rodfim, and then we can't make a decision. That's Moshe's answer. The beautiful answer. The only problem with Moshe's answer is he invents a category that doesn't appear anywhere in halacha, which is nefesh gamor, nefesh lo gamor. How do we define that? We have no idea. That's a completely new category. To say nefesh gamor, nefesh lo gamor. I don't know. Moshe can do that. I guess Moshe does it, but it's a big chiddush that no one appears. It slightly appears in the Srida Eish. It slightly appears, but he doesn't. That's not what he builds his whole tshuva on. Moshe says to build his tshuva on this. It's a big shaila. Moshe says, I wrote all this because of the terrible pirza in the world, that there's so many hapalot and it's a terrible thing, and that's why we need to come and we just say, die. And then I'm amazed that in Eretz Yisrael that they're matir ve'barur pashuk katav halacha brura pi ala rabotenu rishonim afoshim v'poskim mamash kol ubar ben kasher ben manzeh ben stamo ben miyudun lecholei teisak kulam asurim dinei mamash ve'ein litot l'smoch al tshuva hachamzeh. And the hachamzeh was the Sicilian. So I always thought that was very nice. Calls him chacham. And l'smoch alav al chacham, but Professor Steinberg told me the story that when he was a medical student, he took all the tshuvas of the Tzitz on medical halacha, and he made it into a book. He took a little cut of Ilchot Refuah Halacha, and if it's still around, of all the tshuvas of the Tzitz. He brought the Tzitz for Askama, and the Tzitz in Askama ripped into Rav Moshe's tshuva. That was Askama. So he said, Steinberg says. Lo name, lama tamid gegei chazkani. Why are you blaming me for you're going to argue with Rav Moshe? They're arguing with Rav Moshe. Why my first book did Askama be Rav Moshe's a? So he said, why are you so annoyed with him? He said, Ani chacham mi chochmei Yerushalayim. Like I'm just one of the avrechim in Yerushalayim. B'chol ofen, it was a dayan, and it was Av Beit Din, and it was a Rav Shari Tzedek, and b'chol ofen ma'amad. And he's a nice avrech. There was an avrech mode. So the sister was very offended by that. But Steinberg pleaded with him that he should write a different Askama. So he wrote his own Askama, and the Tzitz published his anointments with Rav Moshe in another book. So it's came to Rav Moshe. Question on the Rambam do not undermine the validity of his opinion. So if you say it doesn't matter, I haven't answered the Rambam. Asma. The halacha is still the same. The baby is a real rodef, and the mother, they're both pursuing each other. Therefore, himself, if you look at the baby by itself prior to being born, it's alive. But compared to the mother, it's not a complete soul. So that's the machlok. So it's a beautiful machlok. Because again, it's beautiful to give the balibatim. It's a beautiful shir, and you can do it much longer than I just gave here. And it's a beautiful answer also by Rav Yisraeli. Rav Shaul Yisraeli was a guy in Adon. He was a very, very small man, but he was a gadol. He came from Europe. Rav Kook saved him from Europe, and he studied Mekaz Harav, and he became the Rav of Kfar O'eh, Rosh Yeshiva Mekaz Harav, and he was also founded Eretz Chemda, and all the tshuvas that were written by Eretz Chemda, he edited every single one of them. When Rav Yisraeli died, I think in the early 90s, so then they needed someone to edit the tshuvas. They couldn't find anybody on that stature, so they put like 5 gedolim that each of them would have a different place. Rav Yisraeli knew the whole thing. So the story brings, we're not going to go into Mipad man. Shaul is being threatened, and he says to his arms bearer, to his Nosekelim, kill me. And the shaila is, how can he ask the arms bearer to kill him? It's a yada richter. How can he possibly do that? The same, again, we're looking at, you'll see the Makor, you'll get it for yourselves. The same story about Chanani ben Tradion. The story, we know that the executioner says to him, if I date you to die quicker, will you get me on my base? He says, sure. So the shaila is, if that's the case, if he asks the executioner, so then why is he just breathing the fire by himself? Why does he do it? That was what his Talmidim said. That's the shaila. So Rav Yisraeli in a tshuva in Amud Yomini is speaking about women who took a teratological agent, women who used, I think the actual case is thalidomide, that they took during pregnancy. And the question is, could they turn their pregnancy? That was the shaila. And Rav Yisraeli has a beautiful long tshuva about it. We're going to see a very, very small part of it. He says, Yesh lama, omnam legabei ibud atzmo lada'at, to commit suicide, shenimad mikra da'achadim chem nafshaberem edrosh, Persons in great pain, they can't commit suicide. Person shouldn't complain. But that's for myself. But my friend is a completely different getter. He doesn't. I'm not telling you have to suffer. I have a mitzvah to him. What would I want you to do if I was in that situation? If I wasn't greatly suffering, I wouldn't want to suffer. Therefore, we can understand. Why? How can Shaul say to his arms bearer, kill me? How can he say that? Very pashut. What is the Nosekelim? I say, I would want to get out of the Yisurim. I'm not allowed to kill myself, but you're allowed to kill me because I have mitzvah after the same thing with Chanani ben Tradion. He's not allowed to kill himself, but he's allowed to say to the executioner, "You can kill me." They're different because by Shaul asked the arms bearer. By Reb Chanani ben Tradion, the Katstanori, the executioner, he offers it himself. And here we see that the category that I have for myself is very different than I have for somebody else. For myself, I'm not allowed to commit suicide, but I'm allowed to alleviate someone else's suffering, maybe even at the pain of killing them. He didn't want to speed up his own death, and therefore he doesn't breathe in the fire. He does agree to the Katstanori, to the executioner's suggestion. And he saw that's a big mitzvah to do that. And therefore we could say on that same svara, let's say that the Rav Moshe is right. That is bemet, it's Ritzicha. And we saw already the Chevel Rishonim and Achronim that said Ritzicha. But I'm doing it in order to alleviate the suffering. It's not to do with the mother. It's to do with the child. I say, why this tshuva is a beautiful tshuva, and we could debate it because it seems to open up the possibilities of euthanasia and other things. However, why it's a beautiful tshuva is that up till now our discussion was about a mother and the parents and their tsar and Makshal Aled. Rav Yisraeli puts the spotlight on a completely different area. He says, what would the baby want? What would the baby want in this case? And why does it? And I think that again, we present the Balabatim, and we present this nuanced view of Roe versus Wade. The nuance is to say that there is a question: what would the baby want? What is bemet tovat the child? And what's the tovat? How does that somehow comes in conflict with what the parents would want? And that's that beautiful nuance to say I can guess, and the baby can't say what I want. So a child that's got trisomy 21 or trisomy 18. Or any other genetic abnormality can't say this is what I want. We have to guess what they want, but they are as much a factor in making that decision, but they're not the only factor in making decisions. I think that's the beautiful questions. As it says here that trouble between you don't know the difference between right and wrong. The answer is I do as long as I get two guesses. You can't always get that two guesses. You can't get but we need to try to put in those factors in when we try to come with answers. I wanted to present a couple of states that we have a few minutes left. That we can see a little bit of the nuance. And the last one is the one I really want to get to. A woman's 35 years old. She's got 4 children. She's test positive for CMV. And she gets a positive pregnancy test. So CMV is a very serious genetic virus, leads to all of these terrible things. leads to vision loss and hearing loss and mental disability and microcephaly and cerebral palsy, all these long things. And 90% of children with CMV actually will be born healthy. So we don't talk about 10%, but 100% of people, children, I think this is in England, die every year from CMV. So is that a significant factor in order to terminate pregnancy? Remember, we're talking about she just got a pregnancy test. So this is maybe prior to 40 days. And what we do with CMV, what we used to say is terminate pregnancy. And what we do today is we do a much more complex issue. We look at to see, okay, what's the chance of having the infection? Did it go through? Is it into the placenta? Even then, we look at the small percentages. And again, we don't have time to go through it, but I think that the idea is that oftentimes we'll get a call. The doctor says I have to terminate pregnancy because I have CMV. And if we look at this flow diagram, you understand the actual numbers here, you'll see that in fact, most of the cases, that isn't true. And I have a case in my shul. I have two cases. I once got an invitation to a Brit. I had no idea who it was. And I said, okay, I guess I'll go. I went to the Brit and I was there. And I think, okay, when I get there, I'm going to know who they are. I have no idea who it is. So I go up to the balabos. I assume it's the balabos. And I say, Mazel Tov, I'm Gideon Weitzman. And you invited me to be here. And he said, oh, because of you, that we have the birth. Okay, tell me the story. So he says, my wife was pregnant with the baby. And we had CMV. And the daughter says you terminate, and you didn't, and we didn't terminate. And Baruch Hashem, because of you, the child's perfectly healthy, and here's the baby. And I have a case in my shul that it was the same thing, CMV. We didn't terminate, and the baby's born, and they said the baby's deaf. I said you can see the baby's not. He's perfectly fine, perfectly normal, kid, perfectly normal. So we have those cases all the time. Is that in fact we stop that terminating of the pregnancy, and that's as important to understand. Sometimes we will stop it. Halacha come and say, well, that's the chance of infection is small. BRCA. Let's imagine we have a couple undergoing PGD for BRCA, which already spoke about before. And she forgot to take the oral contraceptive, and now she became pregnant. And the question then, she wants to terminate the pregnancy. So here we have, there's no danger, and the child will just have BRCA, which isn't a death sentence, but they were doing PGD. And the question then we come, okay, before 40 days, could we say that would have been terminated? Remember, before 40 days doesn't mean that everybody can terminate pregnancy. It just means that it's it's a bigger heter to terminate pregnancy. It doesn't mean before 40 days is mutar. And the fact, and if you look at all the poskim, Rav Eliyahu was very, very, very machmir on this, and then Rav Soloveitchik said machmir on this. Others that before 40 days it's not a heter. Before 40 days, if we have to make a decision, that's the easy time to make a decision. So here, that's a question, right? PGD, they're doing okay. So this could sort of say it's somewhat like using contraceptive. However, BRCA is not a death sentence. BRCA is not a very nice thing to live with. It's a very horrible thing to live with. And it's so horrible that this couple are doing PGD for it. And yet, can we say that the child wouldn't want to be born with it? That goes back again to our question of how we can suit it. There's actually a couple in my shul. A couple in their 30s. We changed a lot of the details here, so you want to know who it is. They have two children with Shaka married tooth, CMT. And in week 20 of pregnancy, she's very concerned that she wants to terminate pregnancy. Now, we didn't. That was the answer. There was no test that had shown that the baby that she was carrying had CMT. They hadn't done any test, and they didn't do PGD because they'd spoken to someone else who said you shouldn't do PGD for CMT. CMT is a muscle wasting disease. I just tell you, this couple that they have a child who has this, and the first time I met him, I shook his hands for Shabbat and he fell over. Like he's so brittle. He's so like you could break him with one hand. I mean, but he's perfectly normal. Couldn't ever see he's 100%. Now he's actually in the army, and he's Baruch Hashem, they're perfectly fine. But I remember they came here, and she's crying, and she in fact didn't want to come. And do we terminate pregnancy? So we don't even know there's a problem there, but she's so overly concerned there's a problem. Let's imagine we change one factor here. We do the amnestities, and it has CMT. Now is that a problem? CMT. We have a baby that's got it. It's not life-threatening. Me'idach, they have two children with it. And another child could basically break them. I changed it at one part here. What happened here was actually a very fascinating case. The third child, you have two children that have TMT, and the third child was actually seen to have another problem. Had a problem with he only had one kidney. And they said, what do we do? Because we're just overly loaded, and we're the beginning of career. She's actually a psychologist, and it was just impossible. And I said, Mapitom, we don't terminate pregnancy because I have one kidney. So Mapitom, that's all. And everything's gonna be okay. So when the child was born, a year later, she came to me on the child's first birthday, and she said she's crying. And okay, my parents, you want to say thank you. You want to thank you. Why? Because look at this baby, beautiful little baby, beautiful kid. So I said, so if you're crying, if you're so happy, why are you crying? So she said to me, and she's a psychologist, right? So she said to me, because when we came to ask you this question, you spoke to us like a baba, like, a sore. And that's just doesn't jive with my psychologist understands that. He didn't give any leeway. And it bothered me very freely. But you are right. You're 100% correct. Baruch Hashem. We say we have this perfectly healthy baby now, with one kidney. So and obviously I'm telling you all of my success stories, but I'm telling you the failures of people that terminated and say, I'll come to one failure in a moment. This is a horrible story. This is really a horrible case, but a case that happened to us. A newly married couple got married in the early 20s, and the wife's sister came to help them settle into a new home. And the husband had relations with a sister who became pregnant. Mama's, this is a true story. And she wants to keep the baby. The question here was, the family says that the Meshuggah, how can you keep this baby? The couple, of course, separated. Once the wife found that he slept with her sister, of course, she kicked him out of the house. And all the family said, this is crazy. You've got to terminate pregnancy. This child's going to destroy our family. It wasn't unhealthy. She's not unhealthy, but there's this complex issue, which was before 40 days. So let's change one prat. Newly married couple, wife says, they have relations, she gets pregnant, and he wants to keep the baby. That's not what happened in the story. But let's imagine what happens. So he says, I want to keep, I'm now the divorced brother-in-law, but I want to keep the baby. Why should I keep it? And I saw her. I don't want it to. So if we say it's his rachush, al-pia, cold halacha, so we say lechora, you can say, I don't want to finish it. However, I don't think any posek today would force her to have that baby if just because he wanted. So I don't think we have, it was a complex issue. In the end, the woman did terminate pregnancy before 40 days, and it was probably better. What I wanted to spend a few minutes on, and this is really the crux of the whole question here, and I think this shows the nuance, is what we call today the VUS challenge. So if we do amniocentesis, and we spoke at length about prenatal testing. So we do a chromosomal array, and there's two possibilities. Not even it's normal, we get normal chromosomes, or it's abnormal. Great, if it's abnormal, we have trisomy 18. We have a child that's not compatible with life. So that's the answer. We have normal, then we keep it. But that's not really the answer that we get most times. What we get a lot is something they call a variant of uncertain clinical significance, or a VUS. It's uncertain significance. A VUS is dus. We have no idea what it is, and we're sitting there saying, okay, what does that mean? So, and it's a VUS challenge. And this is the greatest problem today in genetics, and the greatest problem of doing amniocentesis today. There was actually in the next volume of Tchumen, one of the Rabbanim in Machon is an editor in Tchumen. So the next volume of Tchumen is going to come an article, I think it's going to come an article, we'll just say, every woman should do amniocentesis. Amniocentesis is not dangerous anymore. And we get a lot of information, it's important. And three of the Rabbanim in the Machon are writing a paper against that, to say, but the problem is you're going to find a lot of information that we don't know what it is. I'll just give an example. This is an example of a woman. I get a call Thursday night. I have a chavura of guys, we sit and learn Taras HaMishpacha. And I get a call at 10 o'clock at night. Rabbi, we want to speak to you immediately. It's like, tell me the story. This is the story. She's 42 years old. She had 6 pregnancies, 1 miscarriage. She got 4 healthy children, and she's now pregnant. And the youngest child is 4. So the youngest child she had when she was 38. She's now 42. And there's a slight increase in amniotic fluid. Ultrasound worked out fine. At 31 weeks, there's a slight intrauterine growth retardation. The baby's a little small. And they did, okay, so we don't know what it is. So it's 31 weeks. So that's around the time. So we went to do an amniocentesis. Okay. This is the story they tell me at 9:30 or quarter to 10 at night when I'm on the way to my chavura. And I said, okay, well, I can't come now because I got this chavura. Send me the report. So this is the report. You can't know if you can see that. But this is the line that's important, right? There is a line, and it shows there's some missing part of the gene, right? Let's see if I can see which gene it is. Chromosome 11. Okay, so there's a missing part. Now, what does that mean? So if we understand that we spoke about this before, we spoke about genetics, so that the gene, the chromosome, is basically a map of how I'm going to build this human being. That is this growing fetus, which is grown according to this map. and part of the map is missing, right? So I take, this book, right? And, I rip out a book, I rip out one page. So the question is, how much does that infect my understanding of this book, right? So how much could I understand Hegel, Nietzsche, and the Jews by Yirmiyahu Yovel? Could I understand that missing out page 129? And the answer could be, no, you will miss the whole point, because that's the point in which Hegel and the Jews meet, or Nietzsche, attacks the Jews, and which you'll miss the whole point. And it could be, that's irrelevant, because it's just it's a long footnote about Yirmiyahu Yovel's experience with fanatical Jews in the West Bank. There's a long footnote about that. But let's imagine what it is. So you can live without it. So I'm missing a part of the chromosome. How important is that? The answer is, we don't know. So this is what I get, this report, and I'm on the way to Chavura. And I get to the Chavura, and the wife, the Balat Habayit of where we meet, or where we're meeting at that point, she's a doctor. So I said to she's actually a geneticist. So I said to, and she's a family doctor as well. So I said to her, after I want to speak to you. So I pull out this report. She said, where do you get that from? That's from my lab. We discussed that today. That's Mamash. We had this couple, and we don't know what to do with that. So what do? So we put it into a database. There's several databases, and probably the most famous there is Franklin. Franklin's a database named after Rosalind Franklin, who was the Jewish woman who died before receiving the Nobel Prize for her work on double helix, for which Watson and Crick did win the Nobel Prize. And Rosalind Franklin was the long forgotten hero. So when in Israel we wanted to set up a database of genetics, they called it Franklin after Rosalind. Alea Shalom. And she also was not married, so nothing left of her apart from Franklin. So you put it in, this is what we have, and it'll tell you, okay, what does that mean? How does it say what it means? Because we looked at all the cases we have in the world in which we had that missing part of that gene. Now, certain times you get a lot of information. Certain times you get very little information. Why? Because there's very few cases. In this case, there were 3 cases of this in the world. Now, most people who have that will terminate. Why? Because if I'm a goy living in Wyoming, unless I'm religiously fanatical and don't do any termination of pregnancy, I get a little thing. There's something wrong with it. I don't know what it is. We'll terminate, right? If I'm living, we'll go away from Wyoming because it's too complicated. I'm living in Melbourne, right? And I have this thing. I'm going to terminate. So the number of children we have with these missing specific parts of the gene is tiny. So we now have to make a decision based on 3 children who are all under the age of 5. And so we don't really know what the ramifications is. So what do? So we'll check the parents. So we check the parents, and if the parents have that same missing chromosome, then we know that missing chromosome doesn't affect you adversely because we have parents who are healthy. So, and sometimes we'll go to the grandparents, some will go to the family, and sometimes you have a question. We had a question recently of a genetic abnormality in a young couple. They did this. They had a genetic abnormality. They got a psak from their Rav that they're allowed to terminate pregnancy. And I said, B'shum panim ofen, ma pitam, let's go and test. We tested the father, and then the siblings, right, of the mother. It was a maternal thing. Want to test them. The father says, I don't want to test on my siblings. Some are not married. I'm not going to start testing my non-married children, and they're going to come out. They have a problem. And they kept going back, and the Rav said, yeah, you're allowed to terminate because maybe it'll be a problem. And I fought this, and in the end the baby was born, and they should have called the baby, it was a girl, but if it had been a boy, they should have called him Gidon after me, because really, it was really fought for this child. So what happened in this case? So we have this case, we don't know. And the answer is, I don't know. So this is, I get the call, quarter to 10, I go my chavura, 11:30 I get to this couple, 11:30 Thursday night. We sit, and I said, we don't know the answer. So we did a test, and then it disappeared off the radar. And it disappeared off the radar because I understood that for them, they were not able to have that child who was sick. And I know, not because they told me, but because just because I worked it out, is they terminated the pregnancy. And they wouldn't talk to me for a long time. They were very embarrassed. And I'd also have to think of it. I had a case in which there was a couple who called me, and they had a very sick baby. It was very, very late in the pregnancy. It was after 30 weeks. And the baby was really sick. And they asked me and 2 other rabbanim. One of the rabbanim said mutar, and the other Rav said asur. And their Rav was a Rav who said asur. So I called him up and said, look, we have a problem. They're going to terminate pregnancy anyway, because they're not able to hold. This has really got a problem. And it was really sick. And they got a psak already that it's mutar. And the problem is that if you're their Rav and you said asur, they're going to be embarrassed to ever ask you a question again. So you're going to have to tell them it's mutar, or you're going to have to tell them they can ask someone else. And he didn't like, this Rav did not like that answer. A younger guy, I mean, someone a little bit older than me. And he didn't like me pushing him and forcing him to do it. But that's what happened in the end. So the same with this case, they pretend they're pregnant. In the end, Baruch Hashem, they got pregnant again. But I think we have to understand that that's really the challenge. The challenge and the nuance that is missing in this whole Roe versus Wade debate is that there are many cases in which it really is a question. There isn't danger to the mother. Danger to the mother, I think, is included in the changes to Roe versus Wade. Any state will say if the mother's life is in danger, we let her terminate pregnancy. But there are many cases in which we don't understand exactly the ramifications of the information. And the question is, can I hold a couple and say you have to have a baby that's potentially very, very, very sick? And little parts of the embryo, there are very significant genetic abnormalities which come from a very, very small genetic change, maybe even missing one letter. And this is missing a part, I can't remember how many megabytes this was, but this is, missing a certain amount of the chromosome. And it says here, likely pathogenic, meaning that's possible they have a problem. Of course, likely is always a slightly fluid term that we don't know, but we understand that this question of terminating pregnancy on a medical level, even before we get into halacha, is an extremely complex one. And that there are many cases that we saw, a few cases that we saw, in which there are an incredible number of factors that come into play, which is what is also going on in the couple's life. What will be the result of this child being thrown into this mix? What will be the likely pathogen of the child? And I say many times, I'll stop a couple having a terminating pregnancy, as I did to this couple, and they did what they wanted. And I understand them, because I'm not going to raise a child; they're going to raise a child. So I think that I think that the halachic component, I'm sure that many of us know. Hopefully we had a little bit of a chidush, some chidushim that we didn't know. I think that just to understand the complexity of this issue is something that we religious Jews, we Rabbonim, have to come and show our kehilot today. That we have to show the complexity of this question. That it's Jews for or against miscarriage. The answer is it's much, much, much more complex than that. And there are many, many. First of all, there's a machlokot within the poskim, but there are many, many cases in which the answer is not clear-cut in any way, and it really will depend on who you ask. So, b'zeh siyamti. Toda rabba. I'll send you the slides. I understand that the slides from last week, for some reason, I sent them, but they didn't go. I don't know why. So I'll send you last week's slides as well. So you get a double gift for the. So since we're still not saying Tachnan, you guys have a little bit more time, so you can read it during the time you generally would say Tachnan. Sarot tovot, sei gesund, kol tov. We'll see you next week. Next week, I think, is our penultimate week. We have 2 weeks left. I wanted to do in the last week, we'll do something about sensitivity. I don't think I'll give it. I'm not, because I need someone who's sensitive. But next week we'll do maybe we'll do a little bit about sexuality. We'll do for next week some shit that I just gave a series I think is important in England. Well, we'll give it here, and then we'll do a little bit about sensitivity.